Scotland now has a people, and in this episode, new technologies and ideas will transform that people into a nation. Gerahid saw Santashron Macharjian. This is a history of Scotland. Last we saw, Scotland's Paleolithic hunter-gatherers had begun to settle down, struggling to maintain their population as fishermen along the coasts. That coastline was newly minted, as around 6000 BC the modern shape of the British Isles geographically began to develop. As the features of Britain established themselves, the facts of life began to emerge. Scotland had spent much of the Paleolithic Age racked by glaciers, which had raised the fertile soil and ground the country down to its bedrock. The thin layers left when the ice departed were swiftly borne off by the wind, leaving an inhospitable land that drove its people to the sea for comfort. While the lowlands retained just enough soil to sprout the forests that spread across Britain, much of the north was far too rocky and far too elevated for this dense growth, and the first geographical divide began to emerge between the highlands and the lowlands. But little of this mattered for the early people of Scotland. Tied to the coasts, these early peoples seemed content to remain in scattered and small populations on the edge of habitation. Evidence shows that these tribes had DNA from group U5, similar to modern Sami and Finn populations, other pastoral nations with a strong history of independence and isolation. This state of isolation seemed confirmed as the Doggerland, Scotland's last tie to mainland Europe, was swept into the frigid waters of the North Sea. But it would seem fate had a very different future in store for Scotland. Up from the Mediterranean came a new way of life, sweeping the Scots' cousins from Eastern Europe and southern France, and encouraging strife in Britain, contributing to the decline of Mesolithic life on the island. By 4500 BC, the Danubian Neolithic culture had reached Holland, and the first farms began to appear in Britain. These first houses seem to have been built by immigrants and settlers, but over time a native British farming culture began to emerge. But agriculture came slowly to Scotland. In addition to the poor soil already mentioned, evidence from Ireland and northern Britain indicates that a wave of illnesses and genetic issues began to develop as agriculture encroached on the more balanced diets of prehistory. Epilepsy, some diabetes, and pellagra probably delayed the arrival of farms into the Great Glen. Yet with or without agriculture, Scotland was in trouble. The Stargate Tsunami, perhaps the same storm that swept the North Sea and destroyed the Doggerland around 5500 BC, was a cataclysm so powerful it left a layer of sand still visible in Inverness and Wick. This would have been doom for the small fishing communities of Scotland, as the sea overwhelmed their little homesteads and scattered the schools of fish they had based their entire lives around. Scotland teetered on the edge of collapse. And then they were rescued by an unlikely hero, Stonehenge, or rather, that great, intangible being that shapes all human affairs, trade. For you see, while Scotland faced a terrifying flood of apocalyptic proportions, the British Neolithic Age had begun to bloom. With good soil and ready access to water, Britain thrived and its population exploded. There was only one problem with this. It being the Stone Age, the axes, shovels, and hoes on which farming depended were made from that most cherished material of children's dreams and a widow's fears. But where in Britain was good, strong stone available just below the surface of loose soil? So while the British built the sweet track and ploughed their green fields, they were using Scottish hammers and Scottish shares, and from this trade the Scots grew powerful. They adopted pastoralism, guiding the cattle and sheep across their stony homeland and gradually introducing crops like barley in the lowlands. A northern culture began to emerge, extensive chambered tombs like the May Shao settlement. By 3100 BC, this had culminated in the building of Skara Brae, once a fishing village grown into a great stone community with trade, farming, and a maritime culture. And yet, change was coming. 200 years after Skara Brae, the appearance of grooved ware indicates the arrival of a new force on the scene. More complex woodwork begins to emerge, and bows become more prominent, either as a sign of renewed hunting or renewed warfare. But it was not the changes in Britain that revolutionized the world, but those in Spain. A new culture, sporting beaker pottery, beer, and an advanced cultivation, began migrating from the Galician coast and swept across Europe. These people had also emerged from the mountains to grow powerful. In their case, copper tools, allowed them trade, but they now had a new technology: bronze. The powerful mix of tin and copper strengthened tools, improved farming, and forged the First Empire. But tin was rare in Europe, and even copper was hard to obtain. But in the British uplands, vast deposits were readily available. As the soil had been torn away, the ores were much easier to get at in Wales, Ireland, and Cornwall, all of which grew powerful trading in this new beaker culture. But the intense connections involved in trading, producing, and obtaining bronze led to a rise in hierarchy in Europe, the growth of kinship, and the growth of class distinction. The communal graves of Ibister were replaced with the barrows and monuments across Britain, and with it, that most famous image of a highly structured British society, Stonehenge. Again, Scottish stone provided the material for many of these vast henges, but after the arrival of beaker culture in Britain and Ireland around 2500 BC, Scotland joined the closed world of bronze, developing a class of elites who raised the stones at Balgarthno and on Lewis, and erected the barrows at Maes Howe. Scotland was now part of a global network stretching from Welsh tin miners all the way down to the pharaohs of Egypt. With metal tools, the hard Scottish soil could be cut, and agriculture exploded. Roundhouses and farms expanded in Perth and Argyll, and with it the Scottish population grew. Fishing centres became trading centres, exchanging tools and goods with Ireland, France, and Scandinavia. A distinctly Scottish culture began to grow, and people turned away from ranging henges to the sky gods, instead praying to earth gods, the earth from which Scottish life would flow. Around 1700 BC, the dominant Irish cinerary culture was replaced with the Wessex culture. English historians seem to make a great deal about this, but in the uplands and the small farming and pastoral communities of Scotland, things remained largely unchanged. And the tumulus culture was just founded. Interesting. During the 1300s BC, the power of that global network of bronze expanded, with Scottish goods reaching as far as Sardinia, and then suddenly collapse. Historians still debate what led Egypt to withdraw from this global network, but that decision sent shockwaves through the world. Sinai copper vanished and the Bronze Age collapsed. Famine and disease brought down the great empires. Pirates and raiders pillaged civilizations and trade shriveled. Without the metal tools to work the farms, or any grain to trade for their stone, Britain fell into chaos and Scotland starved. There is a sudden appearance of the Rhine culture on the English coast, in such a number as to indicate at least a partial invasion. In Scotland, the population thinned and retreated back to the coasts, building crannogs and fortresses. It appears a war of everyone against everyone, almost as fractured and as primitive as Scotland was in 6000 BC. It had taken them 5,000 years to become a nation, but Scotland was in danger of disappearing once again. This story began with a migration, and it will end with one. That tumulus culture, and its succeeding Urnfield culture, has also been thrown into turmoil by the end of the Bronze Age. We've seen how the Rhine culture developed piracy and raided England, while the Pilnay and Novice Melvace cultures set off to raid other lands. But from the forests around Hallstatt would emerge a new power, one that would sweep across Western Europe. These strangely painted, checked, bearded folk would barely appear in the historical record, but during the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse they would begin to slip across to Britain's shores, leaving an indelible mark on Scotland with a culture that would outlive them, reverberating, nay echoing, down even to today. Cas Agus Craith, friends, the Celts have arrived.